Why it sucks to be a charioteer in ancient Rome. You're standing in a wooden chariot behind for galloping horses, reins wrapped tightly around your waist instead of held loosely in your hands. Hurtling into a hairpin turn at full speed while 250,000 people scream your name from the stands around you. If your chariot flips here and chariots flipped constantly, those reins wrapped around your waist mean you don't get thrown clear. You get dragged. This is the Circus Maximus, the largest sports venue ever built in the ancient world, and if you're good enough at this particular job, you could become the single highest paid athlete in recorded human history. Richer than senators, richer than most of Rome's aristocracy, while still being legally classified as barely above a slave. Today, we're breaking down why being a charioteer in ancient Rome combined genuinely horrifying physical risk with a shot at wealth so extreme that one real charioteer's estimated career earnings, adjusted into modern terms, are believed to rival some of the highest paid athletes alive today. Let's establish something most people don't realize. Chariot racing, not gladiatorial combat, was actually the single most popular spectator sport in the entire Roman world by a wide margin. The Circus Maximus, Rome's primary chariot racing venue, could hold somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators, depending on the historical period or capacity that dwarfed the Colosseum many times over. Races happened on a massive oval track, roughly 2/3 of a mile around, with chariots completing 7 laps at breakneck speed, competing to be first around to tightly packed turning posts at each end of the track called the metae. Those turning posts were where almost everything dangerous happened. Taking a turn too wide cost you precious time and position. Taking it too tight risked catastrophic collision with the post itself or with rival chariots crowding the same tight space. Multiple chariots attempting the same turn simultaneously, at speed, created chaos that could and regularly did end in devastating crashes, a phenomenon common enough that Romans had a specific word for it. Naufragia, literally shipwrecks, used to describe the pileups of overturned chariots, tangled horses, and thrown drivers that happened during nearly every race. And here's the detail that made chariot racing uniquely, horrifyingly dangerous compared to almost any other ancient sport. Roman charioteers typically wrapped the reins around their own waist and body rather than holding them loosely in their hands, giving them more control and leverage over for powerful horses simultaneously. This technique gave skilled charioteers a genuine competitive advantage. It also meant that when a crash happened, and crashes happened constantly, a charioteer couldn't simply let go and be thrown clear. He was physically bound to his own chariot and to the terrified, bolting horses attached to it, meaning a wreck could mean being dragged across packed dirt at high speed, tangled in wreckage and animal panic. With a small curved knife carried specifically for this purpose as your only real hope of cutting yourself free before you were killed or maimed. Just like gladiators, charioteers occupied a genuinely strange legal position in Roman society. Professionally celebrated, legally disgraced. The majority of charioteers began their careers as enslaved people, purchased and trained specifically for racing by the powerful racing organizations known as factions, professional stables identified by color. Most famously the Reds, Whites, Blues, and Greens, which function something like ancient sports franchises, complete with fiercely loyal fan bases who identified with their faction's colors the way modern sports fans identify with a team jersey. A smaller number of charioteers were free men who entered the profession voluntarily, but like gladiators, doing so meant accepting a similarly degraded legal and social status under Roman custom. Regardless of how skilled or celebrated they became on the track, training began young and was brutally demanding. Aspiring charioteers typically started as apprentices, first learning to handle chariots at slower, less dangerous exhibition speeds, gradually working their way up through more competitive and dangerous races as they proved their skill and survived. Injuries during training were routine, and a young charioteer's early career was, statistically, the most dangerous period of his professional life, are precisely when he had the least experience managing a chariot at speed and the least standing within his faction to be protected from the most hazardous racing assignments. Even as a successful, established charioteer, your fundamental legal status as either an enslaved person or a member of a legally disgraced free profession didn't automatically change just because you started winning. Your faction owned your contract, controlled your racing schedule, and profited enormously from your success, and if you were enslaved, technically owned you as property. Regardless of how much money your racing skill generated or how many fans chanted your name in the stands above the track, If you think modern sports fandom gets intense, Roman chariot racing fandom operated on a completely different level of obsession, one that occasionally spilled over into actual political and civil unrest. Faction loyalty in Rome wasn't casual entertainment preference, but was closer to tribal identity. Fans of the Blues and Greens in particular, the two most dominant and popular factions across much of Roman history, formed passionate, sometimes violent rivalries that persisted for generations within families. Roman emperors themselves were known to publicly support specific factions, and an emperor's faction loyalty could carry real political weight, since aligning yourself with the emperor's favored racing color was, in some periods, a genuinely useful piece of court politics. This obsession reached a genuinely staggering historical peak centuries later in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman capital, during the Nika riots of 532. When blue and green faction rivalry escalated into a full-blown urban uprising that nearly toppled the Emperor Justinian, resulted in the destruction of large portions of the city, and left tens of thousands of people dead before Roman forces brutally suppressed it, an almost unbelievable historical example of sports fandom directly triggering one of the deadliest riots in ancient history. For an individual charioteer, this level of fan devotion translated into a genuinely bizarre daily existence. You could be simultaneously the most beloved figure in an entire faction's fanbase, receiving gifts, adoration, and public celebration wherever you went while remaining, in the strict eyes of Roman law, barely a step above property, and while carrying the constant, real risk that your next race could be your last. Here's where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because a small number of elite charioteers achieved a level of individual wealth that remains almost difficult to comprehend even by modern standards. The most famous example, and the one historians point to specifically because his career earnings survive on an actual inscribed monument, is a charioteer named Gaius Appuleius Diocles, who raced professionally across the 2nd century. Diocles competed in over 4,000 races across a 24-year career, winning close to 1,500 of them. His surviving retirement monument records his total career winnings at approximately 36 million sesterces, a figure so large that a modern academic analysis, published in the 21st century, estimated his adjusted lifetime earnings at somewhere in the range of $15 billion in modern terms, a sum that would place him among the very highest-earning athletes in human history, ancient or modern. When adjusted for his specific economic context, Diocles wasn't unique in achieving this kind of wealth, just unique in having his earnings so precisely documented. Successful charioteers across Roman history could command enormous prize purses for individual victories, on top of appearance fees, faction salaries, and gifts from wealthy patrons and fans eager to associate themselves with a winning driver. A charioteer skilled and lucky enough to survive a long career at the top could realistically outturn senators, provincial governors, and virtually anyone in Roman society who wasn't the emperor himself. This money bought real freedom in ways gladiators, even successful ones, rarely achieved at the same scale. Enslaved charioteers who accumulated sufficient winnings could and did purchase their own freedom outright. Free charioteers who achieved this level of success could use their wealth to buy genuine social respectability for their families, funding their children's education and social advancement in ways that could partially outlast their own personal legal stigma, even if it never fully erased it. Set aside Diocles and the handful of legendary names who survive in the historical record, because the overwhelming majority of charioteers never came anywhere close to this kind of success. Most charioteers who entered the profession, particularly the enslaved apprentices who made up the bulk of the workforce, never rose beyond minor, lower-stakes races, earning modest winnings for their factions while carrying full exposure to the sport's genuine physical danger. Career-ending injuries were common. Death during a race, whether from a violent crash, being dragged by bolting horses, or trampling by other chariots during a pileup, was a real and recurring possibility that shortened or ended careers before a driver ever had the chance to build the reputation, faction loyalty, and accumulated skill required to compete for the truly enormous prize purses that made careers like Diocles's possible. The structure of the sport itself made this outcome almost mathematically inevitable. Only a small number of charioteers in any given generation could realistically become genuine faction stars, because faction stables invested their best horses, their most prestigious race slots, and their promotional resources into a small handful of proven, reliable winners, while the much larger pool of ordinary drivers competed for what remained. This meant the gap between a Diocles-level career and an ordinary charioteer's career wasn't simply about individual talent, it was about a system genuinely structured to concentrate enormous rewards into a tiny handful of survivors, while the much larger remaining population absorbed nearly all of the sport's very real physical risk for comparatively modest reward. And yet, despite the legal disgrace and the genuinely brutal risk built into the profession, successful charioteers occupied a uniquely privileged position within Roman popular culture that even gladiators, for all their own fame, rarely matched. Charioteers appeared constantly in Roman mosaics, commissioned specifically by wealthy patrons who wanted images of their favorite drivers decorating their own homes. Surviving examples from across the Roman world show detailed, individually recognizable portraits of famous charioteers, essentially the ancient equivalent of a fan commissioning custom artwork of a favorite athlete. Roman children played with small terracotta and bronze chariot toys modeled directly on famous racing teams, and betting on races was a genuinely massive, widespread part of Roman social and economic life across every social class, from wealthy senators to ordinary laborers. Perhaps most remarkably, several successful charioteers achieved a level of social integration that gladiators, bound by infamia, rarely managed to the same degree. There are documented cases of successful charioteers being granted citizenship, honors, and even limited political influence, particularly in the later imperial period when emperors increasingly used their public support of racing factions as a genuine tool of political engagement with the Roman public. A charioteer's fame, in other words, could occasionally translate into a kind of practical social rehabilitation that partially transcended his technically disgraced legal category as something achieved far more rarely, and far less completely, in almost any other legally stigmatized Roman profession. The charioteer, like the gladiator, occupied a position built on a genuine paradox. Risking death every time he took to the track, technically beneath full legal respectability by Roman custom, and yet capable of becoming one of the wealthiest, most adored, and most culturally significant figures in the entire Roman world, sometimes achieving a level of individual fortune that, even judged by today's standards, remains almost unmatched in the history of professional sport. Being a charioteer in ancient Rome meant strapping yourself, quite literally, to a machine capable of killing you at any moment, in exchange for a shot, a genuinely rare shot, but a real one that had wealth, adoration, and cultural significance that few other professions in the ancient world could offer at anywhere near the same scale. For every Diocles, whose earnings still astonish modern economists 2,000 years later, there were countless charioteers whose careers ended in a crumpled naufrage pile-up on the packed dirt of the Circus Maximus. Their names recorded nowhere, their fortunes never made. The reins were wrapped around your waist either way. Whether that turned out to be the thing that made you legendary, or the thing that killed you, usually came down to speed, timing, and luck that no amount of skill could fully control. If you enjoyed this video, there are more stories on the channel about what it was like to be someone completely different, in a completely different era. See you in the next one.